The world is full of chaos, war, famine, pollution, and pineapple on pizza. Yeah, I said it. But despite it all, we are living in the most advanced era in human history. We have luxuries that our ancestors could never even dream of. But let's hit rewind for a second. Because if you travel far enough back, life wasn't just hard, it was brutal. The Ice Age was an unforgiving nightmare, shaping some of the most resilient and powerful human species to ever exist, like the Neanderthals. These guys were built like warriors, with biology so extreme that today we might consider it almost supernatural. But wait, what if I told you there was another group of Ice Age survivors? A group just as tough, just as wild. They were a branch, because this time, they were us. Well, sort of. Who were they? How did they survive in a world ruled by giants? And most importantly, what happened to them? Stay tuned, because today we're going deep into the world of the Cro-Magnon, the first true conquerors of Ice Age Europe. Let's begin. Cro-Magnons, a population of early modern humans, believed to have been the first of their kind in Europe. Their arrival is estimated to have occurred around 56,800 years ago, during the late Pleistocene. Our understanding of their existence originates from a significant discovery made in France in 1868, when scientists uncovered a cave, later named Cro-Magnon, that contained various human remains, including skull fragments and postcranial bones. At the time, researchers initially believed they had identified a distinct human species due to some intriguing anatomical differences. However, the striking similarities between these ancient skeletons and modern human populations were too obvious to ignore. Today, they are commonly referred to as European Early Modern Humans, or EEMH, for short. This classification was based on several defining characteristics, such as a rounded brain case, upright posture, a completely flat face, a delicate brow ridge, and a remarkably pronounced chin. And, as it turns out, all of these features are also present in humans today. Further proof of their close connection to us was evident in their skeletal structures, which bore a strong resemblance to our own. If you happened to encounter them in what is now Iceland, or mainland Europe, you would likely recognize them as one of us. Unlike Neanderthals, whose distinct physical traits made them stand out much more. That being said, there were still some noticeable differences that set them apart. From the outset, it was clear that the Cro-Magnons were not the kind of people you do want to challenge in a fight. They were impressively built, resembling real-life action figures. This is one of the reasons early researchers initially assumed they belonged to an entirely different species. The earliest Cro-Magnons in particular had noticeably different builds. One of their most striking traits was their size, as they were essentially giants for their time. Analysis of recovered adult specimens suggests that on average, Cro-Magnons were comparable in height to post-industrial humans. Female individuals typically measured around 5 feet 4 inches, 1.63 meters, while males generally exceeded 5 feet 9 inches, 1.75 meters. This made them taller than the current global adult average, a remarkable fact, considering that modern humans are already among the tallest in history. In comparison to other human populations of their time, their height would have been even more pronounced. And that wasn't even their peak. Certain Cro-Magnon groups were truly towering. A specific population from Eastern Europe ranged between 5 feet 10 inches, 1.78 meters, and 6 feet 2 inches, 1.88 meters. To put that into perspective, if they were classified as a nation, those in the upper range would rank as the tallest population on Earth. Even larger Cro-Magnon males existed, with some specimens reaching an impressive 6 feet 3 inches, 1.91 meters, surpassing the average height of an NFL player. And these massive individuals weren't just tall, they were incredibly sturdy. While their skeletal structure was similar to ours in shape, Cro-Magnons were far more robust overall. Their bones were noticeably larger, wider, and denser. Although this trait was present throughout their skeletons, it was especially prominent in their lower limbs and shoulders. For example, the collarbones of a medium-sized Cro-Magnon could reach 19 centimeters, 7.5 inches, making them about 25% longer than the modern average. This increased size provided them with superior leverage for shoulder movements, allowing them to deliver exceptionally powerful swings with a wide variety of melee weapons. Their overall build also heavily implies that in life they were extremely muscular, with some research finding that if you compared an adult Cro-Magnon with a human born in recent times that were of the exact same height, you could expect the former to be about 20% heavier and have a much higher degree of lean muscle. This seemingly overkill amount of muscles and bone strength was in fact necessary for their harsh lives amongst Ice Age Europe, where you had to be ridiculously durable just to scrape by, and multiple fossils have shown that individuals routinely endured and survived a variety of ailments and catastrophic injuries. For example, within the Cro-Magnon rock shelter alone, multiple specimens were found with evidence of infection, while many, and actually the majority, had fused vertebrae in their necks, which is believed to have come from traumatic injuries. Meanwhile, one of the adult females found seemed to have endured a significant skull fracture at some point in her life, but still managed to survive for an extended period of time as the fracture showed signs of bone growth, and to really just drive home how hard their lives were. Even the first Cro-Magnon to ever be identified, a specimen dubbed Cro-Magnon 1, endured an absolutely grueling life as his skull and face were riddled with scars, believed to have been caused by a genetic disease that resulted in multiple cysts and tumors. And yet, based off of his body, researchers could tell that he actually made it to adulthood and in fact was quite old by Cro-Magnon's standards at the time of his death. That being said, reaching old age back then didn't require living all that long. The average life expectancy for Cro-Magnons was typically below 40, much like what has been observed in Neanderthals, who also endured incredibly harsh lives. Because of this, researchers believe that early mortality was simply a common reality during the Ice Age. However, longevity wasn't the only advantage of having a strong, resilient physique. Their robust build also played a crucial role in navigating treacherous landscapes and hunting prey more effectively. This was especially important, given that evidence from animal remains suggests that Cro-Magnons primarily targeted large megafaunal species, including horses, reindeer, bison, or ox, ibex, and even on occasion woolly mammoths, massive creatures by any standard. Additionally, preserved carcasses have been discovered with both pre- and post-mortem wounds linked to human activity, further confirming that these early humans were highly skilled hunters. Even the apex predators of their time were not safe. Various species of large cats, hyenas, and bears also fell victim to Cro-Magnon hunting techniques, with spears made from stone and bone being a commonly used weapon. A notable pattern among many of their prey is that a significant number are now extinct, either locally, as in the case of hyenas, or completely, such as woolly mammoths and/or ox. These extinctions have often been at least partially linked to early human activity, a pattern that, unfortunately, continues to this day. Hunting techniques among Cro-Magnons weren't limited to spears alone. These early humans displayed remarkable proficiency with a variety of both ranged and melee weapons. Their arsenal included spear throwers, javelins, clubs, blades, nets, boomerangs, and possibly even early forms of bows. Additionally, each weapon often came in different variations, some featuring specialized points, others designed with custom grips and so on, demonstrating a high level of craftsmanship and adaptation. Unfortunately, the formidable strength and advanced weaponry of the Cro-Magnons were not always reserved for hunting animals. Just like modern humans, they had the potential to turn their aggression against their own kind, making prehistoric murder a reality. Remember the skull fracture mentioned earlier? It turns out that such injuries, particularly head trauma, were not uncommon among In some cases, the wounds appeared to have been inflicted by other humans. One of the clearest examples of this is seen in Cro-Magnon 2, a male specimen dating back over 30,000 years. He suffered a devastating facial injury, likely caused by a slow but forceful blunt weapon. While the blow wasn't immediately fatal, it ultimately sealed his fate as he died before the wound had time to fully heal. Further examination suggests that, before his death, he endured severe internal bleeding and brain hemorrhage. He wasn't the only one. Other individuals with crushed skulls have been found, indicating that head trauma was a common target in violent encounters. However, death wasn't always the result of a head injury. Soon, Gear 1, another Cro-Magnon specimen, was discovered with a deep cut in his thoracic vertebra, an injury that would have instantly cut off blood circulation to his brain, leading to immediate death. Given the brutal conditions of the Ice Age, such violence may have been driven by fierce competition over essential resources like land, food, and mating rights. These conflicts would have been a matter of survival, making aggression a likely, infrequent occurrence. And while many of us can relate to the idea of fighting over food, for Cro-Magnons, the stakes were far more sinister. Some evidence even suggests that certain victims may have been consumed by their attackers. This theory stems from a chilling discovery in Gough's Cave in England, where human skull caps, dating back roughly 15,000 years, were found. These remains appear to have been repurposed as drinking vessels, or food bowls, hinting at the grim possibility of cannibalistic practices. The unsettling discoveries didn't stop there, as additional grim findings emerged from the same cave. Fossil evidence revealed that human bodies had been completely processed and butchered. Soft tissue, tendons, and muscles had been carefully stripped away using knives, while bones bore signs of being gnawed on and fractured to extract the nutrient-rich marrow within. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this discovery is that out of the 3 apparent victims, 2 were quite young. This suggests that not all prehistoric humans wielded their strength for noble purposes, much like in the present day. Further evidence of this extends beyond Cro-Magnons themselves to their close relatives, the Neanderthals, with whom they coexisted in Europe for thousands of years. The nature of their relationship has long been a subject of intrigue, particularly given that Neanderthals disappeared not long after the arrival of Cro-Magnons. This has led to speculation that interspecies conflict may have played a role in their decline. Although prehistoric warfare is no longer considered the primary reason for the Neanderthals' extinction, researchers now suspect that violence was still present. In fact, recent findings have implicated Cro-Magnons as prime suspects in a 50,000-year-old unresolved case, one involving a slain Neanderthal. This unfortunate individual was found with a severe rib injury, seemingly inflicted by a weapon tipped with a stone point, which resulted in a relatively swift death. While this may not seem like much to go on, further analysis has led the angle of the wound, combined with evidence of low kinetic energy impact, suggests that the fatal blow came from a ranged weapon. This is a significant revelation, as Neanderthals were not known to use ranged weaponry, whereas Cro-Magnons had mastered such tools. Consequently, the prevailing hypothesis is that this Neanderthal was killed by a thrown spear or dart, likely wielded by a Cro-Magnon. This act of violence further underscores the strategic advantage that ranged weapons provided to anatomically modern humans, despite being physically less robust than Neanderthals. Cro-Magnons' superior hunting technology may have given them the upper hand in direct confrontations. Additionally, there is some evidence suggesting that Neanderthals may have even been viewed as a food source. A recovered Neanderthal jawbone exhibited cut marks eerily similar to those found on deer carcasses butchered by Cro-Magnons. The precision of the cuts closely matched techniques known to have been used by early modern humans, leading some researchers to suspect that this Neanderthal was consumed. However, it is important to note that this theory is not conclusive. It remains possible that the jawbone was repurposed as a form of trophy rather than as part of a meal. Additionally, while the cut marks on the Neanderthal jawbone appear to be human, they do not definitively prove that the individual was killed by Cro-Magnons. It remains possible that the Neanderthal had already died before the marks were inflicted. Ultimately, while there is evidence of violent encounters between these two human species, their overall interactions appear to have been relatively routine. Genetic studies even provide clear indications of interbreeding between Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons. Interestingly, it was the earlier Cro-Magnon populations that seem to have had the closest relationships with Neanderthals. One particularly striking example of this is OASE-1, a 40,000-year-old specimen who was found to have inherited approximately 9% of their genome from Neanderthals. This suggests that one of their ancestors, likely a great-great-grandparent, was a Neanderthal. This relatively high percentage of Neanderthal DNA has led some researchers to speculate that the earliest Cro-Magnons may have exhibited certain Neanderthal-like traits. Fossils of early Cro-Magnons show slightly flattened skull caps and prominent occipital buns, features characteristic of Neanderthals. However, as time passed, these traits, along with the higher proportion of Neanderthal genes, gradually diminished. Simultaneously, other distinctive Cro-Magnon characteristics, such as their pronounced robustness, also became less prominent. These changes are thought to be linked, at least in part, to the environmental pressures of the last glacial maximum, which caused significant habitat loss and placed considerable strain on Cro-Magnon populations. Despite these shifts, Cro-Magnons retained some defining features, such as relatively strong jaws and large skulls. Their skull size was particularly important, as it accommodated larger teeth, likely an adaptation to their diet, which consisted not only of meat, but also tough foods like nuts, seeds, and fibrous roots. Beyond their impressive dentition, their large skulls supported something even more significant: their brains. One of the most intriguing aspects of Cro-Magnon anatomy is that their brains were exceptionally large, surpassing even those of modern humans. In fact, their brain volume was more comparable to that of Neanderthals, with an average cranial capacity of approximately 1,514 cubic centimeters, whereas the modern human average is around 1,350 cubic centimeters. A significant factor contributing to the larger brain volume of Cro-Magnons was the substantial size of their occipital and frontal lobes. These regions, which were notably longer than those of modern humans, play a critical role in a wide range of cognitive functions and motor controls. However, the exact impact of their brain size on cognition and behavior remains uncertain. While we cannot definitively determine how their intelligence compared to ours, it is reasonable to assume that they were at least as intellectually capable as modern humans. Currently, 5 distinct cultural traditions, spanning roughly 40,000 years, are attributed to These include the Aurignacian, Gravettian, Solutrean, and Magdalenian periods, each characterized by significant technological and artistic advancements. The ingenuity of Cro-Magnons is further reflected in their weaponry, but intelligence is not solely demonstrated by what one creates. It is also shown through how those tools are utilized. For instance, Cro-Magnons developed sophisticated hunting strategies, allowed them to schedule large-scale kills in alignment with the migratory patterns of megafauna. By employing game-drive tactics, they were able to funnel large animals into natural enclosures such as cliff edges or bodies of water, where they could be efficiently slaughtered in large numbers. During the off-season, they also determined the optimal times to harvest fish, making aquatic resources a significant part of their diet. Additionally, some groups likely followed and lived alongside herds of animals, ensuring that fresh prey was always within close reach, minimizing the need for long-distance hunting expeditions. Their resourcefulness extended beyond hunting, as they also became highly skilled in processing plant-based foods. Archaeological evidence suggests that Cro-Magnons consumed at least 150 different types of seeds, fruits, nuts, and starches, demonstrating a broad understanding of edible vegetation. Moreover, they were likely responsible for one of the earliest instances of animal domestication, the dog. Several Paleolithic dog remains have been found in association with Cro-Magnon settlements, including a 36th. Further supporting this theory is the discovery of a 15,000-year-old dog buried alongside a man and a woman, suggesting that dogs played an integral role in Cro-Magnon society, potentially assisting in hunting or guarding their campsites. Speaking of camps, Cro-Magnons demonstrated remarkable skill in organizing and constructing their living spaces, showcasing yet another aspect of their intelligence and adaptability. Cro-Magnons adapted their living arrangements to different environments, sometimes residing in caves and other times establishing open-air settlements. In these outdoor sites, they constructed large huts, primarily built from mammoth skulls and bones. These structures were then reinforced with grass or animal pelts, providing insulation and primitive bedding to withstand the harsh Ice Age climate. Many of these dwellings included indoor hearths and designated workspaces, allowing for greater comfort and productivity even in extreme conditions. However, the interior layout of these shelters often depended on their size. Smaller huts generally lacked additional compartments or separate areas. These primitive homes were essential for survival, serving as the primary spaces for warmth and protection. Evidence suggests that fires were often lit inside the huts rather than outside, further emphasizing their role in maintaining heat during frigid temperatures. Despite the warmth and shelter these homes provided, Cro-Magnons did not remain indoors indefinitely. Their camps were systematically organized, with specific zones designated for hearths, food preparation, sleeping areas, and butchering activities. Archaeological findings also indicate that Cro-Magnon populations established multiple seasonal camps, allowing them to migrate between sites depending on the time of year. This mobility helped them adapt to seasonal resource availability and prevented overexploitation of a single area. Based on skeletal remains discovered at various sites, researchers estimate that these settlements were relatively small, typically housing no more than a few dozen individuals at a time. Despite their limited population size, these communities were far from isolated. Cro-Magnons maintained extensive trade networks, regularly interacting with other groups. And this was not just occasional bartering. Evidence suggests the existence of well-established trade routes spanning across entire regions of Europe. Raw materials such as stone, shells, and pigments have been traced back to sources located more than 120 miles, 200 kilometers away from where they were ultimately found. The significance of this trade cannot be overstated. For some groups, it was not merely a convenience, but a necessity. Researchers hypothesized that certain Cro-Magnon communities depended so heavily on trade that they would not have survived without it, particularly during the last glacial maximum, when worsening climatic conditions forced populations to rely increasingly on external sources for essential tools and resources. Trade among Cro-Magnon communities not only facilitated survival in one of the harshest environments known to humanity, but also allowed them to enjoy aspects of culture beyond mere subsistence. Art, clothing, and even jewelry were actively shared and exchanged between settlements, demonstrating that these early humans sought more than just basic necessities. Art, in particular, appears to have played a significant role in Cro-Magnon society, manifesting in a variety of forms, including body decoration. They used red ochre pigments to adorn their torsos, faces, and limbs with intricate designs. These ranged from simple dot patterns to elaborate representations of animals and human figures. Additionally, body modification practices such as tattooing, scarification, and piercings were present, though seemingly less common, likely due to the risk of infection. Beyond body art, cave paintings stand out as one of their most enduring artistic legacies. Numerous caves have been found decorated with Cro-Magnon artwork, with one of the most famous examples being the Chouvit cave in France. These cave paintings predominantly feature animals, with depictions of lions, deer, mammoths, horses, aurochs, and bison appearing frequently. More unusual subjects, such as hybrid creatures with both human and animal features, have also been discovered, hinting at possible mythological or spiritual interpretations. Speaking of human imagery, Cro-Magnons had a particular fascination with certain body parts, especially genitalia. One of the most well-known examples of this interest is the Venus figurines, which they crafted over thousands of years. However, if erotic art is not of interest, rest assured that Cro-Magnons excelled in other leisure activities as well, including music. While they were not the first humans to create music, they are believed to have developed some of the most complex musical forms of their time. Much like their tools and weapons, their instruments came in a variety of forms. Archaeological evidence has uncovered flutes, whistles, ideophones, drums, and bull roars, suggesting that Cro-Magnon musicians had a diverse range of sounds at their disposal. These early instruments likely allowed them to produce intricate melodies and rhythms, giving rise to songs and possibly even early musical traditions. In fact, their musical technology was so advanced that many scientists believe we are missing a significant portion of early musical history. It seems unlikely that Cro-Magnons suddenly developed such a high level of musical sophistication without a long evolutionary trajectory leading up to it. If you've ever wondered what their music might have sounded like, reconstructions of their bone flutes provide a glimpse into their musical world, producing sounds that, even today, are quite impressive. Clearly, Cro-Magnons had adapted remarkably well to their surroundings, despite the harsh conditions of the Ice Age. This naturally raises the question, what happened to them? The answer is that they never truly disappeared. Cro-Magnons thrived throughout the late Pleistocene and were exceptionally successful as a species. While the extreme cold of the last glacial maximum limited the regions where they could live, they still managed to flourish. Not only did they survive, but they also maintained high fertility rates over thousands of years, far surpassing those of their Neanderthal counterparts. This reproductive advantage likely played a major role in their dominance in Europe. As their numbers grew, the overall human population of the continent increased nearly tenfold. By 13,000 years ago, it is estimated that over 70,000 Cro-Magnons inhabited Europe, a small number by modern standards, but an astonishingly large population for its time. Unlike many early human groups that vanished entirely, Cro-Magnons were not completely wiped out. Instead, their cultural timeline is thought to have progressed through several distinct phases, beginning with the Aurignacian period, followed by the Gravettian, and ultimately the Magdalenian culture, which lasted from approximately 17,000 to 12,000 years ago, and is considered the final Cro-Magnon tradition. After this period, traces of Cro-Magnon DNA became less common. However, Genetic evidence suggests that their descendants persisted well into the Neolithic, as seen in remains recovered from France and Spain, while modern human populations retain much less of their genetic legacy. Remnants of Cro-Magnon ancestry still persist in many European lineages today, and so the story of the Cro-Magnon comes to an end, or does it? From fearless hunters to the first true conquerors of the Ice Age, they were more than just survivors. They were pioneers. But what do you think? Were the Cro-Magnon the ultimate humans of the prehistoric world? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Click on the video on your screen to keep learning more with our content. See you in the next video.